And we can start to look at timings, performance variables, as well as some of the motions of the segments. What we found was that overall turning performance was in fact similar across all the pitch conditions. So there were individual differences, but as a group of 19 players, the difference was the performance levels were very similar, non-significantly different. The exit speeds also non-significantly different. If you look at ground contact time, which was about 0.45 of a second, there was a tendency for slightly faster contact times in Spain, probably because the surface was just slightly harder and it was the first surface they were being tested on, I'm not sure, but still non-significant. The red columns are the football turf or artificial turf conditions. If we looked, this is a busy slide, but I'll explain it to you. If we looked at the different phases of ground contact, and we looked at how much slip occurred, what we have is the most amount of slip is in phase 2. H refers to Holland, the 3 pitches in Holland. N refers to the 3 pitches in Norway. S refers to the 3 pitches in Spain. The asterisk is the artificial turf. So it's the middle one here and the last one there. The most amount of slip occurs with phase 2, which is mid-support. And you can see that for the asterisk conditions, there's slightly more slip in every country. And what you've got, though, is a tendency for, if there's more slip, there's a tendency for more time being spent in that phase, which makes sense. If you're slipping, you spend more time. There's one exception, though. Here, in Norway, for the artificial surface, in this one, the timing decreases for the artificial surface. The reason for that is that particular surface was what we call a floating surface. So there was no connection between the very base layer and the top yarn and artificial fibers. It was allowed to slide a little bit. So players would turn and they would actually bunch up the artificial surface slightly. And they would get a bit of extra grip from that. And it was predicted slip. And the players they found it quite comfortable. So that's given us slightly different results due to the structure of the turf itself. In general, though, the natural turfs were very similar and non-significantly different. If we look at the rear foot acceleration in that initial phase, all conditions were non-significantly different except for this first pitch. This was the first pitch in Holland, which was slightly damp. It had rained the night before, some things you can't control, and was slightly wet under soil. It still passed the tests for the mechanical test device, but it was slightly wet compared to the other surfaces, the other natural turf surfaces. It gave us a lower result on the mechanical test data and also a lower result on the subject data. That data we also overlaid with landing velocity. And on each of the asterisks, which is the artificial turf, you can see that there's a slightly lower landing speed, which might suggest the perception of a slightly harder surface. If we go back to the filtering graph that I showed you, remember we were talking about this rate of change of acceleration or jerk. Well, we did have a look at that, and disappointingly, it didn't come out as being significantly different. There was a tendency for the jerk to be higher on the artificial surfaces, but not significantly so. Just an example, player data here. The dark ones, again, are the artificial surfaces. Notice that with this player data, on the artificial surfaces, the jerk was much more variable, higher and much more variable. So we're looking more closely into that as to what's causing that additional variability, and what can we get from that? Do we take peak values, or do we take average values? Something we're looking at. What's the criteria? It's still ongoing research. It's the first time we've seen this data described in this manner. What we did find, which was generally significant between the artificial and natural turf pitches, was ankle supination. This is a very busy slide again, but just quickly, this is the range of supination, and don't forget the red is artificial. So you can see it's higher. This one here is the peak value of supination, maximum supination. So there will be this angle here as you're turning. Again, you can see there's a tendency for them all to be higher, and 2 of those are significant, and all 3 supination velocities are significantly different. So in combination, there's some indications that there may be a greater risk of injury. We don't know for sure, but if you've got the combination of a more unfavorable posture and a more rapid movement about the joint, a greater stretch on the ligaments perhaps, then that's pointing in the right direction to be a greater risk of injury, most likely. So what are some of the conclusions? Averaging across the group, there appears to be no major differences in turning performance across the various natural and football turf pitches. That's not surprising, because it's getting quite popular now for players to play on artificial latest generation pitches. And clubs like Ajax and a lot of clubs in Norway, they do not have many major problems with their players, with injuries and complaining about performance aspects. So there's no major differences. What we're talking about really then is subtle differences. But do the subtle differences matter? That's the issue. All players demonstrated a similar sequence in terms of how they contacted the ground, with an initial heel-first landing and with that initial phase having high-frequency motion characteristics that we think are important. Maximum traction during the initial landing phase was actually quite similar, except for one of the pitches which agreed with the mechanical test results. Players experienced reduced peak traction on that one. In general, the differences between the pitches were evident, as I've just pointed out, in the ankle supination, where the ankle supination motion occurred quicker and to a greater extent on the football turf. Regardless of football turf structure, the rate and extent was consistently greater. Now, what's the implications for that? Well, as I said, it might suggest that you're more susceptible to fatigue in that case, but who knows? If we start to look at the anecdotal evidence first for that, well, first of all, let's illustrate what's going on. What you've got is this is landing, similar posture between the artificial and natural turf. Similar there when the forefoot makes contact, and that's the phase where you've got the differences, where the dotted line is the natural turf, And the blocked line shows a typical posture for the football turf with greater supination angle here. What would be the stats on that? Well, if you look at the literature, there's not a lot of hard evidence on injury stats between artificial surfaces and natural turf surfaces. The ones that are out there, and there's 2 papers by Jan Ekstrand, printed in 2006, and a very recent paper, where he concluded that overall, injury risk is not different between artificial and natural turf, overall. However, of the multitude of variables that he looked at, there was one that came out as being consistently higher risk on football turf, and that's lateral ankle sprains. For elite male players when playing on artificial turf, that was coming out in both those studies. Also, there was a tendency for the women as well, although not statistically significant. To present the flip side, there was a study by Fuller who found in collegiate level players that there was no significant injury risk difference. However, Stefan, in 2007, found there was a tendency for higher risk of ankle sprain when playing on artificial turf. So there's some evidence, some indications that there's a greater risk of injury.